else, and I found out about the woman you're going to meet this evening, Betsy Munro Fisher. You may wonder why the story is being told here in Hebron. There is a patent of land, which was in North Hebron, which was granted to Betsy's father, the Reverend Henry Munro, who was the chaplain of the 77th Highlander Regiment in the British Army during the French and Indian War. So he named the area Munro's Meadows, which is how it happened to be called that. It was one of the first settlements in Black Creek, which is now the town of Hebron. And Betsy was born in Philadelphia, but her mother died when she was an infant. She's going to be telling you more of that story. But her father decided that he wanted to start a religious colony in Hebron, and she spent a summer here that was one of the happiest of her life. Betsy is going to be portrayed by Clothier, who's currently the assistant historian for Saratoga County. She served as the education director for the Brookside Museum in Boston Spa for 13 years, and she's a longtime reenactor, living historian, particularly focusing on women of the colonial period. So we welcome Clothier as Betsy Munro Fisher.
Thank you, Debbie.
Yes. Probably, yeah.
Okay.
Just
Read that. There we go.
The Reverend Harry Munro, my father, was a native of Scotland. After receiving his education, he was appointed chaplain to the 77th Regiment of Foot, commanded by General Montgomery, and was sent to America at the conclusion of the war in the year 59. My father became acquainted with the widow of an officer who belonged to the same regiment. This widow became wife to my father and mother to me. I was born in Philadelphia the 2nd day of December in 1759. My mother died 3 days after my birth and left me to the care of my father, who soon procured a wet nurse for me in Burlington, a Quaker lady whom I remained with till my father remarried a second time and took up his residence in Princeton, New Jersey. I was then taken home to my stepmother. I became very fond of her, as she was fond of me, and soon forgot my nurse. 11 months after her marriage, she was delivered of a son. Sometime after her recovery, my father took it into his head to go home to England to be ordained for the Church of England, preferring that to the Church of Scotland. Now, as I'm going to be talking this evening, I have some items that I'm using to share the story of Elizabeth. And I'm going to be referring to some of these back and forth, again, as items to help share that story. And first, as a child who lost her mother at 3 days, we can first take a look at this. This unassuming little piece of pewter would have been a lifeline for infant Betsy. And this is known as a pack boat. And it could be used for feeding sick people, and it could be used for feeding infants, especially those who had no other choice because their mother was gone. And so this would be filled with a mixture of milk and maybe some breadcrumbs and maybe even beef broth, and that is what these children would have. Now, thankfully, Harry Munro was able to find a wet nurse for Betsy, who also helped to raise her. But that loss of mothers seems to be a theme in Betsy's early life, unfortunately. And as we heard, she became quite attached to Miss Stockton, her father's second wife. And unfortunately, that was not long to be. While Harry had gone to England to be ordained, she was taken with a fit and expired in a few minutes. A servant was sent off in haste to try and catch him before he departed. But the next day, when he heard the melancholy news, the death of a woman whom he loved, it was customary in those days to bury the dead after candlelight. When my father came home, my mother's corpse was gone to the place of interment. I remember my father wept bitterly. The next day, my nurse was sent for from Burlington, and my little brother and myself were given into her care. He then took his departure for England. And a few months after my father's absence, the nurse was alarmed by seeing the child in a fit. The doctor sent for, but in vain, the child was soon a corpse. So again, this loss continued throughout Betsy's early childhood. When he arrived home from London and the nurse informed him of the death of his son, his feelings were deeply wounded. He left me in the care of that nurse and came to New York. So this is what Elizabeth was experiencing for her first few years. And the dates aren't exactly clear about this, but she was old enough to remember that her stepmother was fond of her and she was fond of her stepmother. So there was certainly some consciousness, so she must have been at least 3 or 4 years old while all of this was happening. And so a father left with a young child is in want of another mother for that child. And so Harry Munro was introduced to a Miss J. And Miss J was actually 2 years Harry's senior. And at this point, he knows that her family is of some money and of some influence. And he has high hopes that this money and influence may be enough to help him be the rungs of a ladder as he climbs his way upward. So he proposes to Miss J, and they are married, but Harry Munro is sorely disappointed to discover that the extent of the gifts, the betrothal gifts, amount to some furniture, not the fortunes that he had envisioned. And unfortunately for both Harry and especially for Betsy, it is discovered that Miss J is not of the maternal variety. So, Elizabeth, or Betsy, goes on to explain some of her experiences with Miss J. After they removed to Phillips Manor, I was sent for. My nurse brought me home from Burlington to my stepmother. The nurse stayed a few days with me and then returned home to her family. I remember I fretted much after she left me, as my stepmother began to be very cross with me. When my father was from home, she would, for the least misconduct, whip me and then lock me up in the cellar for a whole day. So, poor Betsy was left to her stepmother's temperaments. The servants would sometimes send me refreshments through the cellar window, as I was left with neither victuals or drink. Often in this situation, I have cried myself to sleep, and whenever my father and she had any dispute, she would revenge herself upon me. When near her time, being 10 months after marriage, she went to her father's, who lived at Rye, and took me with her, where I remained all winter under the care of her mother and sister, who were actually fairly kind to me. On the 10th day of January in 1766, she was delivered of a son, who was baptized by my father a few days after birth, and named Peter J. Munro. So this was to be Betsy's stepbrother. Now, this unhappiness continued in spite of the new bouncing baby boy in the household that perhaps Betsy had thought might bring some joy, but it did not. The stepmother was quite cruel to her, and Betsy developed ways of seeking her own forms of revenge. Now, one particular account is something that leads us to discover that Betsy can be a complicated narrator. And again, depending on one's feelings on this topic, this may change some feelings about Betsy. But knowing what she had suffered, especially at the hands of this stepmother, I encourage you to remember that. I must here give my readers some account of my conduct during the time I lived with my stepmother, she being so cruel. I was always on my watch to do her all the mischief I could. She had a parrot that she used to learn everything about the past when she was gone from home. One day our hired women expected company to come and drink tea. They went to the cellar and took butter and flour to make some cake. Paul was very quiet. They drank tea and went away. Some of the cake being left, they put it in a basket and hung it up in the kitchen. My mother came home and went into the kitchen. When Paul began to talk, "Cake basket, cake basket," my mother went and took down the basket and found the cake, for which the servants got a severe reprimand. I'd been playing in the yard, and with a stone I'd knocked over one of her little bantam hens. I was for throwing it into the necessary, the privy pit, but the servants requested me to give it to them, and they put it in the oven. When my mother was done scolding about the cake, Paul cried out, "Oven chicken, oven chicken." She opened the oven and found the fowl. She began to inquire how it came to be there, and they told her I was the one playing in the garden, and that it had been struck. This did not go over well. I was called for. Nothing would excuse me from a whipping, and I got it severely. I was determined from that moment to be the death of the parrot when opportunity would serve. One evening, as my mother had gone out to supper, I was trying to discover some method to kill the parrot without it coming to the knowledge of the servants. At length it hit upon me, which was to give her fat meat with salt upon it. When my mother came home, the parrot was sick, and the morning next was dead. If anyone likes parrots, I'm very sorry. But again, this gives us an idea of what Betsy was enduring in this household. And for quite some time, this is what was happening to Betsy. And as we can see, it seemed to be affecting her mentally, emotionally, and physically with those whippings, with that switch. So, if we go forward a few years, my father had a patent of land granted him for his services as chaplain in the army. As was the case, many of these soldiers received land. And so he was quite eager to see that land and see it developed. And it amounted to 2,000 acres, which he drew in a place now called Hebron in the county of Washington. As he wished to settle tenants on that patent, he went to this place in May of 1775 and took me with him to spend the summer season. I had not been long there before I perfectly recovered my health and was much delighted with this change, being at liberty finally to range the woods as I pleased. My time was chiefly spent in seeking birds' eggs and catching little fish with a pinhook. My father provided a companion for me, a girl about my age who went with me everywhere I pleased to go. The summer being past, my father said to me one day, "Betsy, my dear, we must think of going home to Albany. The winter is coming on, and if you're a good girl, you shall come here again next summer." We were at dinner when my father spoke these words to me. After he went out, I went to my bed and wept bitterly. To think of returning to my cruel stepmother appeared to me worse in anticipation than death. I begged of my father to leave me in the country. I told him I did not wish to go home to my stepmother. My father seemed hurt at my expressions, and he said he would endeavor to get me board with a decent family for the winter season. He did. He was acquainted with a Mr. William Reed, who lived in a place now called Salem in the county of Washington. I went there to spend the winter. My father took his leave of me, saying he believed he could not see me again until spring, as he had business in Philadelphia, which would detain him some time there. I was perfectly happy, because I had not to return to my stepmother. Now, as Harry traveled to Albany, he made a stop along the way, and happened to see a Duncan Campbell, one of the Duncan Campbells, where he remained some days, the weather being very stormy. And at that point, Mr. Campbell suggested that he had a son, and Harry Munro had a daughter, and perhaps maybe they should become acquainted. And so Harry decides that that is a lovely idea and supports this. Now, Betsy, however, upon meeting the younger Campbell, was not impressed. When Mr. Campbell paid his visit, I was surprised that my father could consent to his coming to see me. He was about 6 feet high and 45 years of age, no teeth, gray hairs, and of course I could not like him. Now remember, these are the words of someone who at this time was 16 years old being presented with this gentleman. My answer was no. Now what does he do, this Campbell fellow, but go to Albany to meet with my father? And he obtained my father's consent and immediately bespoke his wedding clothes. He prevailed upon my father to write me a letter informing me of what had been done. On his return, he came to see me and spent the afternoon. After tea, we took a walk some distance from the house, when he told me he had a letter for me from my father, and took out his pocketbook and gave it to me. Anxious to return to my lodgings and to learn the contents of the letter, I excused myself and went to my bedroom to read it. The contents were as follows. My dear Betsy, Mr. Alexander Campbell is here with me and has asked my consent for you to be his wife. I have given my consent, providing his father will make over that part of his estate that he now lives on, to his son. So in that case of his son's death, his widow and children may have something to depend on. Which request Mr. Campbell assures me which will be immediately complied with by his father. Therefore, my dear child, as soon as this is done, I shall expect you to come to Albany with Mr. Campbell to my house to be joined in wedlock to a man whom I esteemed as a good man and a gentleman. And if you refuse your consent, you must not expect forgiveness from me. Your affectionate father, Harry Munro. Well, Betsy certainly has thoughts upon this matter. When I received this letter, I was astonished at Mr. Campbell's conduct, to get my father's consent before he had obtained mine. As Mr. Campbell was the bearer of this letter, I read it in his presence, and my answer to him was this: Sir, as you have courted my father, you may marry him, for I will never marry you. A good bon mot for Betsy. And so he was sent away. This soon came to my father's ears. I knew not what to do. I feared he would send for me home, which I dreaded. I was in great distress, knowing not which method to take to avoid the displeasure of my father, as I was very fond of him. Some time before I left Albany to go into the country, my father had purchased 2 small lots of land about a half-mile from the city of Albany, and built a storehouse and a dwelling house where he lived. And as I mentioned, my father and stepmother lived very unhappy. They had separate beds for each other, which is a bad sign. Her heart and soul were in her son. So Betsy does not want to go home. She does not want to see the consequences of having turned down Mr. Campbell. And so, at this point, she manages to remain up in this area. Those wonderful summers, gathering flowers and birds' eggs and catching little fish. She manages to continue a bit longer. I had no relations. I had to seek my living amongst strangers now. In the month of January 1776, Mr. Fisher became acquainted with me. The first time I saw him was at a meeting. Now, Mr. Fisher, being of the same regiment as my father, was very desirous of getting acquainted with me. He took his lodgings in the same house at which I boarded, where he was informed of what had passed concerning Mr. Campbell, my father, and myself. He made Mr. and Mrs. Reed his confidants and told them that he would reward them handsomely if they would endeavor to get me to consent to permit him to visit me. They soon, by persuasion, gained my consent to see Mr. Fisher. After he'd been introduced by Mrs. Reed, she said that she and her husband had been acquainted with him for many years, and he was a good man and a man of property, and would make a far better husband than the man my father wished me to have. Being young and inexperienced in life, I was soon made to believe that I should do well by marrying Mr. Fisher. But I must confess, I had no affection for him. The thoughts I had upon the subject were these: I shall have someone to take care of me. I shall have a home. I shall never be a trouble to my father, for surely he wants to be quit of me, or he would not have been so angry with me for refusing Mr. Campbell. And another thing which was great weight upon my mind was that I should be out of my stepmother's power forever. So the courtship with Mr. Fisher continues, and not long after, they head to Albany, where they are married by a Dutch minister. Now, Harry Munro does his best to dissuade this. Base, unworthy child, what could tempt you to ruin yourself and break your father's heart? I will never consent to your marriage with Mr. Fisher for many reasons. He's too old for you. He's no gentleman. If you take any rash steps, your blood will be on your own head. I will never own you as my child or give you 1 shilling portion. I thought you were a girl of more good sense and a better spirit than to throw yourself away on the like of Mr. Fisher. Your offended father, Harry Munro. So, she continues, she marries, and she and Mr. Fisher set up housekeeping, though unfortunately, with the interference and constant presence of some of his family members, who are always around, whom she doesn't particularly enjoy the company of. Now, she really is starting to regret her decisions. She has now trapped herself. And so at this point, she is in what we would today call in an existential crisis. She almost takes it in mind to try and drown herself, but falls asleep on the side of the creek, only to be found by a very confused Mr. Fisher, who finds her in such a state of chaos and undress that has no idea what had happened. And so she's taken home, and they, again, continue to live together. Now, we lived among Mr. Fisher's relations till the latter end of April, without hearing anything further from my father. A few days after the affair above related, I was standing at his brother's door when Mr. Reed came and handed Mr. Fisher a letter to read. Sir, I wish you to go to Mr. Fisher and tell him to go to my patent and take his wife with him and take possession of my house and farm and everything that is there, as I am not satisfied that my daughter is living with these people. Mr. Fisher, remembering what had passed, was unwilling to go. He did not wish to be beholden to my father, but I rejoiced at the news and could not rest until he went with me there. I must say Mr. Fisher was fond of me, and that as I had lived there the summer before with my father, I thought it would seem like home to me. So we went back to Hebron the 1st of May. Mr. Fisher did take with him his father and a brother and a nephew and a niece, and we had a boy of my father that was bound to him until he was of age, and this constituted our family and the household. The house was furnished and the farm stocked. Mr. Fisher did not understand farming. All this business was left to other people. In June, as the people were mowing grass, Mr. Fisher, having nothing better to do, began meddling about and decided to build a fire and some small sticks that had fallen from the trees, and the barn was then alight in fire. It being near dinner time, the horn was blown for them to come. While sitting at dinner, a smoke was observed coming round the house. They ran to the door, and to their surprise, they saw the barn on fire. It was filled with wheat and hay of the year before. The fire, it seems, had been communicated from the brush Mr. Fisher had kindled to the straw, and which was scattered all around, and by that means conducted to the barn and soon set it into a blaze. They all ran to get some calves out that were confined, but could not. The barn was consumed in a few minutes. So much for Mr. Fisher's work. We did not raise enough to support our family that year. We spent the summer gaining nothing. And on the 14th of November, 1776, I was put to bed of a fine sun. During the winter, I was confined to my room with a broken breast. The child was very healthy, though. And then later, at this time, Burgoyne came down with his army to Skenesborough. This put the country all into confusion. Knowing not what to do, Colonel Williams came to Mr. Fisher and begged him, as he had been in the British Army, to go and procure a protection for him and all the committee in Salem. And so Mr. Fisher does agree to do this, but at what cost? Accordingly, Mr. Fisher took leave of his family and went to see the general. He made known his errand and sent Baker back with the result to Colonel Williams. I expected Mr. Fisher home every day. Then, a party of riflemen surrounded our house about 6 o'clock in the morning and inquired for Mr. Fisher. I told them he was not at home. They asked me where he'd gone. I told them, upon which they ordered me out of my house with a threat that if I did not immediately comply, they would burn me in it. I took my child from the cradle and went out of the house. I sat down at a little distance and observed them taking out all my furniture, and then they burnt the house. In this situation, without a home and no one near me to whom I could apply for advice or assistance, not knowing where nor what way to go to find Mr. Fisher, I was at a loss of what to do. At last, seeing a man drive a cow, I asked him which way he was headed. He answered, to the camp. I asked him if he would let me go along with him. Yes, said he, if you can keep up with me. I arose from the ground, for I was sitting down with my child on my lap, and followed him. I walked that day, in the company with this man, 22 miles, and carried my child. By the middle of the day, I had neither shoe nor stockings, for I had worn through both, and tossed the stockings aside. On account of the fatigue of carrying my child and walking so far, I was willing to lay down and die. On the road, this man would often say that he did not know, but perhaps a party of Indians might be out scouting, and if so, we should fall sacrifice to them. At first, I was alarmed at this prospect, but my fatigue at length was so great that I told him I wished they might come and kill me and my child, for I was almost exhausted. I'd had nothing to eat or drink all day, except for the water that he gave me, that we dipped out of the creek in his hat. Finally, we came to a house at sunset. There was a woman and 7 children. Her husband had gone. I stayed there the night. And the next day, the man went with his cow to camp. This cow was all he had, and he wanted to sell her for money. I sent by him to Mr. Fisher, letting him know where I was. Mr. Fisher came to me that evening, and the next day I went to the camp. After I'd been a few days in camp, I bought everything my child and I needed. I was related to Mr. Fisher what had been done at home. Now, when she says she was able to buy everything that she and her child needed in camp, we must pause and think about the resources that were present with the army of Burgoyne. We think about the fighting men, the cannons, the muskets, the cartridges, all of that. But to outfit a woman and an infant, there were other resources as well. This was a moving city of thousands of people. And there were people selling goods, apparently goods to outfit a woman and child. And so that reminds us, again, of the size, the scale of Burgoyne's army that's moving right down through this very area, rolling through the very backyards of so many who lived in this area and were farming and setting up their hopes and dreams right here. So we return to Betsy. We then concluded to remain in the British Army. We stayed in the camp till Burgoyne capitulated. In October following, I was eyewitness to the last two battles at Stillwater. I was eyewitness to the death of General Fraser. I was in the same house with him. I saw his death and his burial. After we were defeated, we saw hard times. Provisions were scarce and not to be had for money. I must now give you some account of what passed from the time of our retreat until the capitulation took place. We retreated after the last battle to Saratoga, where we had camped a small distance from the river to prevent their cannon from having any command over us. And having nothing to do, just awaiting General Burgoyne's orders. And they waited quite a long time. We were deprived of all comforts of life and did not dare to kindle a fire, for we fear we should be observed from the other side of the river, and they might fire on us, which they did several times. Being about the middle of October, we suffered cold and hunger, and many a day I had nothing but a piece of raw salt pork, a biscuit, and a drink of water. Very poor living for a nurse. At this time, I had my child at my breast, being 11 months old. One day, wearied of living in this manner, I told some of the soldiers' wives if they would join me, I would find a way to get some provisions cooked. 7 of them joined me. I spoke to some of the soldiers that were invalid and told them if they would make up a fire back in the wood and get a large kettle hung on, we would fill it with provision and cook it, and that would last us some time. They consented to do it for a guinea. Now, a gold guinea in 1777 is an impressive amount of money. So, roughly 20 pounds and 1 shilling, if I remember correctly. And this would be the equivalent of, depending on one's calculations and methods, being offered at least $200 to do this errand, to start a fire, and to have a kettle going. So in that kettle, they put their provisions. They put everything they had. Some of that salt pork, any vegetables they might have had some chance to find. And so we went to work and built up the fire, hung on the kettle and put the water in it. Then we women put in what we pleased. We soon filled it with a variety. It began to boil. We all kept distance from the fire for fear of the cannon that were placed on the other side of the river on a high hill. They soon discovered our fire and saluted us with a cannonball. It struck and broke our kettle to pieces and sent the provisions in the air. We met with no hurt, only losing our intended feast. The soldiers demanded their pay, which I paid, But as the disappointment was so great, the rest declined paying anything, saying they'd lost enough by losing their provisions. So for my folly, I had to pay for all. Now, a few days after the capitulation took place, and when we saw the soldiers lay down their arms, Betsy was given a chance to head northward with many of the other loyalists and refugees that were with the army. Now, the actual soldiers and the followers, the women and children with those soldiers, they became part of the convention army, and they were off on their own journey, heading over to Massachusetts near Boston at a very terrible time of year. But the refugees, the loyalists, could go to Canada. Mr. Fisher said he was going. I refused going with him and went back to Hebron, where I meant to have stayed. Mr. Fisher proceeded on his way to Canada. On his arriving at Diamond Island, he met my father, who asked for me. Mr. Fisher told him that I was not willing to go to Canada, at which my father was angry and said he must go back and bring me and the child. Mr. Fisher came for me and told me that's what my father said. I was surprised that my father should insist upon my going to Canada. I'd never spoken a word to him since my marriage to Mr. Fisher. To please him I went, and when we got to Diamond Island, my father was gone on his way. The next day we followed and overtook him at Mount Independence. He was walking in company with a general. When we landed, he came and took my hand and kissed me and looked at my child. He asked if I'd named him. I told him I had not. You must, says he, call him after me. This was the first time I'd seen or spoken to my father since my marriage. He likewise told me he would see me in Montreal. The next day we set off across Lake Champlain, the season of the year being far, far advanced. We found it very cold and stormy. We were 11 days on the lake in an open boat. It snowed and rained every day. We slept on shore every night on the ground, as there were no inhabitants in that area, all having fled. On the 22nd day of November, we landed in Montreal. As the river St. Lawrence was almost frozen over, we found it exceedingly cold. So this is the account of a woman who has experienced a great deal. And we must remember at this point, she's still a teenager. And so she has a young child, and she has now witnessed the British Army surrendering. She has seen so much. She has endured so much. And her journey, sadly, is not over. So they do spend time up in Montreal, and she suffers a variety of issues up there. They do still have resources, which we also get a hint about when she talks about being able to pay a full guinea in that attempt to get that meal made prior to the surrender. So they do have resources, but as was the case with so many loyalists up in Canada, that area and the British government was not prepared for this wave of loyalists, refugees coming northward. So they have certainly a rough winter, a very cold winter as well. So these are just a few of the things that Betsy experienced. Now, we're skipping ahead a little bit, certainly, but she decides that she wants to return to Hebron. And there are a few variations of this story, and she does certainly recount some in her memoir, but one of those versions ends up being agreed to by the court in Albany because her brother, her stepbrother, Peter J. Munro, accuses her of having forged a deed for the property in Hebron. Now, forgery, in the 18th century in particular, was a very severe crime, and forgery could be punished by death. But for Elizabeth, she is sentenced to life in Newgate Prison in New York City. And so this is all happening right around 1800, and she's convicted and sentenced in 1801. And she is sent to prison. And I do have her prison record here. And this does provide a very interesting sort of peek of information about Elizabeth. Now from this document, compiled in 1801, we can see Elizabeth Fisher, born in Philadelphia, and so she is 41 years old now, and her usual residence is listed as Canada. And we can then continue across and see that the crime was having utilized a forged deed. She's then described as being fair complexion, brown hair, 5 foot 2 inches and 3/4 tall. Do not forget the 3/4 apparently. With dark eyes, and having been convicted in the court in Albany, sentenced to life on the 10th of March, 1801. So this is a very sad and tragic turn of events for Betsy, who again has gone through so much. And she continues in prison. She actually becomes a leader in the prison, in the women's prison there. She's put in charge of the inmates. And she actually is starting to become accustomed to this and refers to them as her family. Now, in 1806, a pardon is secured, and she is released from prison. And now she's in her late 40s, without a friend, and just released into New York City. She thankfully knows someone there who's willing to take her in, where she can stay for a couple of months. And so she begins to make her living with needle and thread and sewing. And so by doing this, she can earn some money to support herself. And so this is her existence for a while. Now, by 1810 roughly, it seems that someone has told her that she has had an interesting life. And that is certainly putting it mildly. And so thankfully for us, thankfully for historians, she sits down to write her memoir. Now, in part, she's doing this as a bit of a vindication. She's a social vindication because she's already been pardoned. She's already been released from prison. And so her reasons for writing this memoir really seem to be to get her story out there, her side of the story, her information, to share it. And again, thankfully she does this because that gives us such a peek into 18th century in general, but especially the experiences of a woman, a refugee, with the Burgoyne campaign. That story of the kettle and the guinea and the cannonball is an amazing piece of documentation that we are grateful to have and to be able to share with people today. The humanity she shares through all of this, sitting with an infant on her lap while her house is burned in front of her. This also gives us the other side of the story from what is taught in the textbooks. We hear about the patriot cause. We hear about all of that. But we don't hear about some of the more negative things that were done in support of that patriot cause. The burning of the Loyalist houses. And at that point in time, she wasn't Mr. Fisher, and they weren't officially Loyalists. He had just gone to the Burgoyne's camp by the request of some of the local Americans to get protection. But because of that turn of events, They become loyalists because they've been treated so terribly, had their home burned right in front of them. So this is something that we are grateful has been preserved. She goes on to say, as she finishes up her memoir, "When I was discharged from prison, though a stranger, I was never refused credit. I always mentioned that I had been lately discharged from the state's prison, and my creditors never troubled me. I enjoy good health, a flow of spirits, and a calm mind, no way disturbed concerning the things of this world. I endeavor to live decent, and do so as I wish to be done by. Instead of my brother doing me harm by sending me to prison, it has been the will of God to order it for my good. I can say with truth that my heart is weaned from the cares of this world. Every soul has best wishes for its welfare. What a change! I can never be thankful enough for this happy change, for now, whether I have plenty or not to supply my wants, I am easy, for I know God is my friend, and he will, I trust, be my honest endeavors, supply my wants in this life. My sincere wish is that God may be pleased to work such a reformation in the hearts of my brother and my children. I do not wish them to go to the state's prison to obtain this reformation, but I wish this may take place in their hearts, and then they will feel as happy as I do. Although I'm in a state of poverty, I am happy. I think I can say without vanity that I possess a generous heart and am honorable in all my dealings. I am always happy to have it in my power to serve my fellow creatures without interested motives. If in my power to accomplish it, no person should be in want of the real comforts of life. All should be happy in this world. In a future edition of this work, I shall endeavor to show by letters and affidavits and leave the public to decide how far I am guilty or innocent in this unnatural and unhappy circumstance which has taken place between my brother and myself. But for want of time and money, I must now conclude." And there she ends her memoir. There's a tantalizing hint that she had planned to write another one. I am not aware that she ever did. But with a bit of research, I did look into seeing what happened to Elizabeth after her memoir concludes. And it does seem that she did go back to Canada. It seems that by 1816, she has decided to marry again. And so Elizabeth Munro Fisher marries an Abijah Cheeseman, an innkeeper at St. John's. And so they are then united in marriage. I have not found out exactly when she died. I have found that there's a reference to an 1845 and even an 1850 date of death. And I'm still trying to find the proper documentation. But either one of those, if either one is true, is an impressive span of life for someone who was born in 1759. And so I do hope she lived a good and long life. And I find it quite comforting the way she ends her memoir, talking about how she has been reformed, how she hopes that those who had done her wrong can find a similar sort of relief and peace. And so, with that, I leave you the story of Betsy Munro Fisher. Does anyone have any questions or comments or anything you'd like to share? Yes?
What happened to her son and Mr. Fisher?
Yes, so Mr. Fisher died, I believe, around 1799. I didn't get into all of the particulars of their time up in Canada, but she and Mr. Fisher did not have a happy marriage. There was a lot of mistreatment of Elizabeth, if her memoir is correct, and there was a lot of infighting and things like that, even theft from her by Mr. Fisher. And so, yes, 1799 he dies. It seems that she had 3 surviving children. At one point she mentions having, I believe, 5 children. Apparently a couple of them died fairly young. The children she had were Harry or Henry, depending on which document you're reading, the eldest that's named after her father by his request. And he went on to live a long and happy life and ended up actually in Wisconsin. Then there was also an Alexander and an Elizabeth that she called Eliza. And so those are the 3 children that I know the most about. So at varying, it seems sometimes that they have a challenged relationship, especially where she's ending talking about hoping that some peace can come to her brother and her children. So there seem to have been some potential challenges there as well. But yeah, that's the rest of the story for a couple other members of the family. Yes?
To write a memoir like that, one would have to be rather educated. I wonder if she reveals in the memoir where she became so literate.
So I believe part of it has to do with having a father who's a clergyman. And so it seems that she learned to read and write, perhaps under his tutelage, perhaps in part under maybe the better stepmother for a while. And she doesn't really get, I believe, too much into any sort of formal schooling. But there is a document, in fact, I believe it is the marriage records to Mr. Cheeseman in 1816, where I did find her signature. And so she did have a decent signature. Sometimes when we look at these old documents, someone is just signing with an X, and they write, the clerk writes their name on either side of it, and then they write her mark on above and below that X. But that doesn't seem to be the case for her, in that she does have a signature in 1816. As for the memoir itself, I do really wish she had gotten a little bit more into the how and the why she was writing it. If she had help, if she was sitting there talking and someone else was writing this out, kind of like an interview, or if this is a manuscript that she compiled and then submitted to a printer. And then when it comes to the topic of the printer, who paid for this to be printed? Printing is not cheap. So whether this was thought to be something almost a little bit sensational, that maybe the printer wanted to print this as maybe a bit of a money-making opportunity or something like that, we don't know. So those are definitely questions that are left lingering. We're not entirely sure what the rest of the story is with that memoir, but she does appear, again, to be fairly literate. So. Any other questions or comments?
Ian, did you ever find out what the brother did with the land?
I have not gone down that rabbit trail yet, so I am not entirely sure.
Have you, I know you've studied women of the 18th century. Have you ever come across a memoir as sad as this poor woman?
Yeah, this one is definitely one of those ones that certainly tugs at the heartstrings, but she's also pretty brutally honest about herself. She talks about killing that poor parrot, and I didn't get into the fact that she also took out a couple of her stepmother's dogs, and so pets were not safe in Betsy's presence, apparently. But again, whether this brutal honesty is, again, sort of that sensational kind of thing to keep people reading, or whether it's her getting it off her chest and confessing these sins as part of this attempt to gain peace. I don't know. But there was an interesting article that came out of, I think it was University of North Carolina, and it is see if I can find it quick here. Yes. It is an article entitled "A Variety of Domestic Misfortunes, Writing the Dysfunctional Self in Early America." So the dysfunctional self certainly could be a term used to apply to Betsy. So by her very own confession.
Did her, go
Sorry.
ahead. Go
I
ahead.
already asked a question.
No, I asked.
My question is related though, so
Yeah.
it seems like it is very much of a type. Was this a good seller for her?
I haven't been able to find anything about it. I've been
How many
looking.
copies exist now? Like, is it something you can find easily out there? Or
Not
is it
easily.
something-
I must admit I'm very grateful to archive.org, which has it fully digitized and available for reading online, downloadable as a PDF. The internet has brought us many things, both positive and negative. But as a historian and a researcher, the internet is wonderful for actually making these things available right in my own house at 2 a.m., which is when I do my research. So I'm not having to drive to Albany or to New York City to sit down with a paper copy in front of me. But to the best of my knowledge, it's not something that turns up. It's not something that you find on Abe Books or on Amazon you can get a reprint, absolutely. But for an original little copy of this 45-page book printed in 1810, I haven't come across any other extant copies, much as I would love to. So it's hard to say how widely it was distributed. And again, still not entirely sure about the reasons for it being published. But again, some of it smacks of that kind of sensational, because at this time, it wasn't uncommon for there to be, essentially printed confessions at the time of executions. You'll sometimes find broadsides that were printed and that are allegedly the dying confession of this doomed criminal that's sentenced to hang. Whether they actually were their actual testimony or the creativity of a printer, who knows? It's hard to say. So this isn't a completely unknown genre of someone, again, confessing these things, sharing what they did. And it also can be seen as a cautionary tale, because Elizabeth, again, says that she endured this loveless marriage where she was abused, and she was also the victim of the abuses of her stepmother, and all of these things were happening to her. But again, she's also confessing that she was no angel throughout all of this as well. So it again is a very interesting sort of thing to consider and analyze and think about. Let's see, yeah?
Is this written like around the same time the Penny Dreadfuls were written?
A little bit earlier.
Okay.
But yeah, there certainly can be some parallels and connections sort of drawn between those.
Yeah, when you were talking about the confessions and how they would like make them real sensational.
Yeah, yep. So, and this could be seen as some of the roots and foundations for that, certainly. And I don't know how many others of this exact sort are out there. We know that there's a few because it has been the topic of that article I mentioned out of University of North Carolina. This author is taking a few of these different types of confessionals and comparing and contrasting them. But exactly how widespread, it's hard to say. So, yeah.
Have you actually gone to Canada to research?
I want to so bad, because I do focus a lot on Loyalist studies, And so Elizabeth is not the only person that I focus on. I do recognize some familiar faces that I saw over at the Tavern Talk over in Hudson Falls recently. And if we happen to have seen each other there, you know, I talked a lot about Mary McAlpin, another Loyalist woman who was living in this area. And I do want to get up to Canada, and I know there's some amazing resources up there, in part through the United Empire Loyalists, which is kind of the Canadian equivalent of the DAR, SAR, Sons and Daughters of the American Revolution. And I hope to.
That'd be great to hear what you found out.
Oh, yes. Any other, yes?
I'm curious about what she's doing before she's convicted, before 1801. Is she still up at St. John's in Canada, or has she come back?
She has come back and is trying to set up housekeeping, it seems, in Hebron. And yes, and apparently she produces this deed. And she says it's the real deed from her father. Her stepbrother does not. And apparently, depending on who you ask, the evidence was quite damning. The Peter J. Munro gets someone to testify, whether truthfully or not, that they witnessed the forging of this deed. And that seems to be the damning piece of evidence that, that there was a witness. Another thing that I didn't mention, toward the end of her memoir, she does mention that a older colleague of her father's later on says something along the lines of course your father deeded the property to you, and like sort of is this witness in that sadly was not available during the trial. But then again, after she's pardoned, she hears this and it helps her feel better. And she certainly includes that in her memoir. So
how long roughly did she live in Hebron again during that?
I don't know that I can say for absolute sure. I'd have to take a look and see if it really spells it out. Sometimes in her memoir, she is specific to the day. Other times it's kind of nebulous and it's not entirely clear. So I'd have to go back and look. If you wanted to check in with me after, we could take a look at printouts. But she does spend a lot of time in Canada, Hebron, and then Albany, and the trial, and then about 6 years in, 5-6 years in New York City in prison. And then a little bit of time in New York City, and back up to Canada, and so she's all over the Hudson Valley and beyond. So, yeah.
As someone who off mommy dearest pets, okay, does she strike you as a woman that would sign a forged document though in front of someone? I'm just curious what your opinion is.
I'm someone who, I don't know, I would like to believe her that this was something that her father